It was never your child." The words were not shouted. They were not delivered with the heat of rage or the tremor of grief. They were spoken by her husband, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, with the flat, cold precision of a physician delivering a terminal diagnosis. The sentence fell into the crushing silence of the grand library, a room paneled in dark, unforgiving mahogany that seemed to drink the very light from the air. Eleanor stood before him, a hand instinctively resting on the slight, still secret swell of her abdomen. The fire crackled in the hearth, a lively, indifferent sound against the sudden winter in her veins. Outside, a miserable autumn rain wept against the tall arched windows of Blackwood Manor, the droplets tracing paths like tears down the glass. She could smell the rain, the damp earth, and the cloying scent of beeswax used to polish the acres of furniture that furnished their gilded cage. "What did you say?" she asked, her own voice a stranger's, thin and brittle. Alistair did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on a sheaf of letters spread across his vast desk, his knuckles white where he gripped its carved edge. He was a handsome man, sculpted by generations of privilege into a form of remote perfection. Tonight, that perfection looked like cruelty, carved from marble. "You heard me, Eleanor. I have been a fool, a blind, trusting fool, but my eyes are open now." He gestured to the papers, forged letters. She knew it with a certainty that was as sharp and painful as a shard of glass in her heart. But it did not matter what she knew. It only mattered what he believed. "Who told you this lie?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "It is no lie." He finally looked at her then, and his slate-gray eyes, the eyes she had once found so compelling, were vacant of any warmth, any memory of the woman he had married. They were the eyes of a judge. "My cousin has been more loyal to this family's name than its own Duchess. Marcus has uncovered the whole sordid affair." Marcus Thorne. Of course, his cousin, with his serpent smile and his solicitous whispers. He had been a constant presence, a shadow in their marriage, offering Alistair counsel and her a brand of sympathy that always felt like poison. She had felt his resentment, a low, simmering thing hidden behind perfect manners. And she had never warned Alistair, because how could she explain a feeling? How could she fight a phantom? The nausea that had been her companion for weeks rose in a bitter tide. This was not the gentle sickness of new life. This was the acidic burn of annihilation. He had taken the word of another man over hers without a single question. He had weighed 5 years of her life, her fidelity, her quiet devotion, against a handful of papers and found her wanting. The foundation of her world did not crack. It turned to dust. She did not scream. She did not weep or faint or plead. A profound, chilling calm settled over her. It was the calm of the condemned, the quiet acceptance that everything was over. The woman he saw before him, the Duchess of Blackwood, was a ghost. He had killed her with 4 simple words. "I see," she said. The sound was hollow. She turned and walked from the library, her spine straight, her head held high. Each step was a measured, deliberate act of will, a refusal to shatter before his cold, condemning gaze. She walked through the cavernous halls of Blackwood, past portraits of his ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with the same silent accusation. The air, thick with the scent of old money and older secrets, felt suffocating, a slow-moving garrote. In her bedchamber, the opulence was a mockery. The silk hangings on the 4-poster bed felt like a shroud. The silver-backed brush on her vanity seemed to whisper of a life that was no longer hers. She looked at her reflection in the grand mirror. A pale woman in a fine gown, a stranger with haunted eyes. That night, she did not sleep. She planned. As the first hint of a bleak, gray dawn touched the sky, she moved. She did not pack the gowns or the jewels. She left the diamond necklace Alistair had given her for their last anniversary, lying on the velvet cushion of its box, its cold fire a reminder of a cold heart. She left the title, the privilege, the suffocating weight of being her grace. She dressed in the plainest traveling dress she owned, a dark wool the color of a stormy sea. From a locked hat box, she took the modest sum of money she had saved over the years, coin by coin, from her personal allowance. It was a habit born of a childhood with a profligate father, a fear of destitution she had foolishly thought she had left behind. Her hand hesitated over one object on her dressing table, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a lark with its head thrown back in silent song. Alistair had given it to her during their courtship, a rare moment when the stiff Duke had allowed a glimpse of the man beneath. He had carved it himself. It was a symbol of a promise, a future that had turned out to be a lie. Her fingers closed around it, the smooth wood a painful comfort. She slipped it into her pocket. It was the only thing she took, a single piece of paper and a pen. Her note was short, devoid of the emotion that raged within her. "You have your wish. I am gone." She left the note on her pillow, weighted down by the heavy gold of her wedding band. Then, with her small satchel in hand, Eleanor, the Duchess of Blackwood, walked out of her room, down a servant's staircase, and into the damp, misty morning. She did not look back. She was no longer a duchess. She was a survivor, and her only thought was of the tiny, innocent life she carried within her, a life she would protect with the ferocity of a lioness, a life that would never know the cold shadow of the man who had denied its existence. The world outside Blackwood's imposing gates was vast and indifferent. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the clean, sharp smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor breathed air that did not taste of betrayal. It tasted of freedom and of fear. 5 years passed. They were long and short, brutal and beautiful. They scoured the softness from Eleanor, replacing it with a resilient strength she had never known she possessed. The Duchess was buried deep, a ghost of a memory. In her place was Ellen Reed, a widow with quiet eyes and capable hands. She had found her way to Saltwind, a small fishing village on the coast, a place of wind and salt and hard work. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and stifling drawing rooms of her past. Here, the air smelled of brine and tar and frying fish. The sounds were of gulls crying, waves crashing against the stone pier, and the gruff shouts of fishermen. It was raw, and it was real. She found work and lodging at the Salty Dog, an inn run by a formidable woman named Martha Gable. Mrs. Gable was a widow herself, with a face mapped by sun and sorrow, and a heart that was surprisingly soft beneath a granite exterior. She asked few questions, and expected a full day's work for a fair wage. Eleanor mended fishing nets until her fingers bled, scrubbed floors until her back ached, and laundered sheets in steaming vats of lye soap. It was grueling, humbling work, and it saved her life. Her son was born in her small attic room with only Mrs. Gable to help her. She named him Leo. He was the sun that had risen in her perpetual twilight. He had her dark, curling hair, but his eyes, from the moment they opened, were a startling, familiar shade of slate gray. They were his father's eyes. It was a daily, painful, precious reminder. Leo grew into a bright, curious boy, with scraped knees and a pockets full of shells and sea glass. He was a child of the tides, with the salt wind in his hair, and an easy laugh that was the most beautiful sound Eleanor had ever heard. She raised him on stories of brave sailors and clever mermaids, not of dukes and duchesses. His world was the cobbled streets of Saltwind, the wide expanse of the beach, the loving but no-nonsense affection of Mrs. Gable. It was a small world, but it was safe. It was theirs. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the ghost of the Duchess would surface. Eleanor would lie awake, the feel of silk on her skin a phantom sensation, the memory of Alistair's cold voice an echo in the quiet room. She would touch the small wooden lark she kept hidden in a loose floorboard. It was a foolish sentiment, keeping it, a weakness, but it was the only proof that the girl who had once believed in love songs had ever existed at all. Meanwhile, 100 leagues away, Duke Alistair Beaumont inhabited a silence of his own making. Blackwood Manor, once a symbol of his power and lineage, had become his tomb. After Eleanor's departure, a suffocating emptiness had descended upon the great house. The silence in the dining hall was no longer a sign of ducal decorum. It was the sound of absence, the sound of a life unlived. Marcus Thorne was a constant presence, his counsel ever ready, his companionship a slow poison. He had what he wanted. He was the Duke's closest confidant, the presumed heir to the Blackwood fortune, if not the title. Yet Alistair found no comfort in his company. Marcus's triumph was a gloating, oily thing that soured the wine and left a bitter taste in Alistair's mouth. Doubt, at first a tiny, unwelcome seed, began to grow in the barren soil of his heart. It was a turn of phrase in one of the forged letters that didn't sound like Eleanor. It was the way the groom, the supposed witness to her infidelity, had vanished so completely after receiving a handsome sum from Marcus. It was the flicker of panic in his cousin's eyes when Alistair asked a question that was sharper than intended. He began to watch Marcus, not as a cousin, but as an adversary. He saw the greed behind the mask of concern, the ambition that pulsed beneath the veneer of loyalty. The regret that had been a dull ache sharpened into a blade of pure agony. What had he done? In his pride, his arrogant certainty, had he destroyed the one good, pure thing in his life? Had he condemned his own wife, his own child, unheard? The thought became an obsession. He hired a man, Mr. Finch, a former Bow Street runner of legendary discretion and tenacity. He gave him a single task: find the truth. He did not ask him to find Eleanor. He could not bear the thought of what he might learn. He only wanted the truth of that night. For 2 years, Mr. Finch worked in the shadows. He traced the money Marcus had paid the groom to an account in the Americas. He found the forger, a man of dissolute habits living in a London slum, who, for a price, confessed everything and provided a sworn statement. The conspiracy, so cleverly woven by Marcus, unraveled thread by thread. The final report lay on Alistair's desk, in the same spot where the forged letters had once rested. It was a testament to his own monumental failure. Every word was a nail in the coffin of his pride. He had been a fool, yes, but not the way he had thought. He had been a cruel, blind, arrogant fool who had allowed a viper to poison his mind and destroy his family. He had not just wronged Eleanor, he had shattered her. The desolation that followed was absolute. He dismissed Marcus from his life and his house with a cold fury that left his cousin pale and trembling. But there was no satisfaction in it. The only thing that mattered was Eleanor. He gave Mr. Finch a new directive: find her. It took another year. Eleanor had covered her tracks well, but Finch was relentless. Finally, a report arrived: a small fishing village called Saltwind, a widow named Ellen Reed, who matched the Duchess's description, and a boy, a 4-year-old boy. Alistair rode for Saltwind himself. He left his ducal carriage and his retinue behind, traveling with a single aide in a plain coach. He felt like a petitioner, a beggar. He was the most powerful man in 3 counties, a duke of the realm, and he was terrified. He saw her first in the village market. She was haggling with a fisherman over the price of mackerel, a woven basket slung over her arm. The sea air had tanned her skin, and the hard work had lent a new strength to her posture. Her gown was simple, faded wool, her hands bare and chapped. She was more beautiful than he had ever remembered. A fierce protective ache seized him, so powerful it stole his breath. He was a ghost at the edge of her life, a life she had built from the ashes of the one he had burned down. He did not approach her. What could he say? He followed at a distance, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. His coach came to a stop at the old stone toll gate at the edge of the village, waiting for a cart to pass. A small boy with a shock of dark, curly hair was sitting on the low stone wall, a small posy of wildflowers clutched in his hand. He was kicking his heels against the stone, a picture of carefree innocence. Alistair's aide got down to pay the toll. Alistair, his throat tight, bought a small basket of ripe, dark cherries from a vendor, the simple transaction feeling momentous. And then the boy began to whistle. It was not a known tune, not a nursery rhyme or a popular song. It was a simple, wandering melody, a lullaby. A lullaby. Eleanor had composed herself, a tune she would hum under her breath when she thought no one was listening, in the quiet evenings in the Blackwood Gardens. A melody he had heard 100 times, a melody that only the two of them knew. The basket of cherries slipped from Alistair's numb fingers, spilling across the floor of the carriage. He could not breathe. He could not think. He only stared at the boy. The boy turned then, perhaps at the sound, and looked toward the coach. His eyes were slate gray. They were Alistair's own eyes, staring back at him from the face of a son he had never met, the son he had denied. The world tilted on its axis, and for the first time in his life, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, understood the true meaning of devastation. It was not the loss of a wife. It was the discovery of a son, found 5 years too late. He found her cottage at dusk. It was a tiny, whitewashed dwelling, nestled against a cliffside, with a small patch of garden where herbs and hardy sea pinks grew. Smoke curled from its chimney, a fragile plume against the bruised twilight sky. He stood before the simple wooden door for a long time, the polished confidence of a lifetime stripped away, leaving only a raw, terrified man. He knocked. The door opened and she stood there, a lamp held aloft in her hand. The warm light cast shadows across her face, accentuating the fine lines around her eyes that had not been there before. For a moment, there was only shocked silence. He saw a flicker of the girl he had married in her wide, dark eyes, before it was extinguished by a cold, guarded weariness. "What are you doing here, Your Grace?" The title was a blade, twisted in an old wound. It created a chasm between them, the distance from a duke to a commoner, a husband to a stranger. "Eleanor," he breathed her name. It felt like a prayer, a plea. Her expression hardened. A small figure appeared behind her, peering around her skirts with wide, curious eyes. His son. Alistair's gaze dropped to the boy, and his carefully prepared words disintegrated. "Leo, go inside," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She pushed the boy back into the cottage and stepped out onto the threshold, pulling the door partially closed behind her, a barrier between Alistair and the life she had built. "You have no right to be here," she said, her voice low and trembling with a fury she fought to control. "You have no right to look at him." "He is my son," Alistair said, the words raw, torn from his soul. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. "He is my son. I am the one who carried him, who bore him, who stayed up through his fevers and taught him his letters. Where were you, Alistair?" "Oh, that's right. You were in your grand house, believing I was a whore and he was another man's bastard." Every word was true. Every word was a lash he deserved. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I was a fool. I was deceived, Eleanor. By Marcus. He forged the letters. He paid the groom to lie. I have proof. I have confessions. It was all a lie." He had expected this to change things. He had imagined this moment, the grand revelation, the dawning of understanding in her eyes. He had been a fool then, and he was a fool now. She looked at him, and there was no relief in her face, only a profound, bottomless pity that was worse than her anger. "Do you think that matters now?" she asked quietly. "The lie was not the thing that broke us, Alistair. Your believing it was. That you could look at me, your wife, and see a stranger capable of such deceit. That you had so little faith, so little trust, so little love for me that a few words from a jealous man could erase everything. The letters didn't matter. You failed me. You cast me out. Your words now changed nothing." She was right. The proof he had so painstakingly gathered was meaningless. It was an excuse, a way to shift the blame. But the blame was his. It belonged to him entirely. "Leave," she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Leave Saltwind and never come back. You are a ghost from another life. Let us be." She turned to go back inside. "No." The word was quiet, but it held the unshakable force of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. She paused, her hand on the latch. "I will not leave," he said. "You can tell me to go to hell, Eleanor, and I will deserve it. But I will not leave this village. I will not leave my son again." He would not use his power, his title, or his wealth. He would not command her or threaten her. He would simply stay. It was the only thing he could do. He would remain, a penitent at the gates of the life he had thrown away, and wait. For what, he did not know. A chance, a crumb, anything. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. Then, without another word, she stepped inside and closed the door, leaving him alone in the cold, salt-laced darkness. The click of the latch was the sound of a final judgment. Alistair did not return to his comfortable coach. He walked through the unfamiliar streets of Saltwind until he found the Salty Dog. He rented the smallest, meanest room it had, a space under the eaves that smelled of damp wood and old ale. The next morning, he sold his coach and horses to a surprised local squire for a fraction of their worth. He was no longer the Duke of Blackwood, a man of consequence. He was simply Alistair, a man living in a rented room, a man waiting for a miracle. Life in Saltwind was a lesson in humility. The villagers stared. They whispered. Who was this fine gentleman, living like a pauper at the inn? He ignored them. His world had shrunk to the size of this village, to the hope of a glimpse of a woman with haunted eyes and a boy with his own. He saw her every day. He saw her scrubbing the front steps of the inn, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw her carrying heavy baskets of laundry, her arms straining with the effort. He saw her walking with Leo on the beach, her face softening as she watched him chase the waves. He never approached. He just watched, his heart a constant, dull ache. He began to perform small, anonymous acts of service. One morning, she found a neat stack of chopped firewood on her doorstep, enough for a week. Another day, as she struggled home from the market, her basket laden with potatoes and bread, he fell into step beside her. He did not speak, simply took the heavy basket from her hands and carried it to her cottage. She said nothing, but he saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes. He set the basket down at her door, gave a small, formal bow, and walked away. He sent for Mr. Finch. The investigator arrived with the heavy leather dossier containing all the evidence of Marcus's treachery. Alistair did not take it to Eleanor. He gave it to Mrs. Gable. "Please give this to Mrs. Reed," he said to the innkeeper, who regarded him with shrewd, suspicious eyes. "Tell her she need not read it, but it is here if she ever chooses to." Mrs. Gable took the dossier. "You've caused that girl enough pain, Your Grace." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm aware of that every moment of every day." He spent his days walking the cliffs, the wind whipping at his fine coat, a garment that was becoming increasingly out of place. He began to talk to Leo, not as a father, but as a friendly stranger. He found the boy trying to sail a crudely made toy boat in a rock pool. The mast was broken. "May I help?" Alistair asked, his voice gentle. Leo looked up at him with those startling gray eyes. "It's broken." Alistair knelt on the wet sand, his expensive trousers soaking up the salt water. He took the small boat. With his penknife, he carefully reshaped the mast and used a bit of twine from his pocket to re-rig the tiny sail. His hands, accustomed to signing ducal decrees and holding fine crystal, were surprisingly adept. He had always been good with his hands, a secret hobby he'd never shared with anyone but his father. He handed the boat back to Leo. "There, she should sail true now." Leo launched the boat into the pool. It caught the breeze and sailed perfectly to the other side. The boy's face lit up with a brilliant smile. "Thank you, sir." Eleanor had been watching from a distance. She saw the gentle way he knelt, the careful patience in his hands, the unguarded look on his face as he watched her son smile. Her heart, so long barricaded behind a wall of anger and pain, felt a tremor. It was a dangerous feeling. A few days later, Alistair knew he had to finish what he started. He could not undo his past, but he could secure her future. He returned to London, a brief, surgical trip. He found Marcus at their club, holding court, basking in his position as the Duke of Blackwood's presumed heir. Alistair did not cause a scene. His voice was low, but it carried across the hushed room. He laid out the facts of his cousin's betrayal, calmly and methodically. He did not present the dossier, but he made it clear he possessed it. He spoke of the forger, the groom, the flow of money. He spoke of the lies that had cost him his wife and son. By the time he finished, Marcus Thorne was a ruined man. His friends melted away, their faces masks of shock and distaste. The web of credit and influence he had built collapsed in a single afternoon. Social annihilation was swift and absolute. Alistair left him there, a pariah in the ruins of his ambition. He then visited his solicitor and had the story of the Duchess's complete innocence discreetly but thoroughly circulated. Her name was cleared, not that it mattered to the woman now known as Ellen Reed, but it mattered to him. He returned to Saltwind, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. He had righted a public wrong, but the private one remained, a vast, gaping wound. That evening he sat on the cold stone of the pier, watching the fishing boats return, their lanterns bobbing in the harbor like fallen stars. The sea was calm, the sky a deep, star-dusted purple. He felt a presence beside him and turned. It was Eleanor. She was holding the leather dossier. "I read it," she said, her voice quiet. She did not sit. She stood, a silhouette against the fading light. He nodded, unable to speak. "He is a monster," she said, referring to Marcus. "But you let him be. You listened to him." "Yes," Alistair said. "The fault is mine, Eleanor. Mine alone. My pride, my blindness. I cannot forgive myself for it. I do not expect you to." She was silent for a long time, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against the stones. He could feel the struggle within her, the war between her righteous anger and the weary pull of something else. "Leo asked about you today," she said, her voice softer now. "He called you the boatman." Alistair closed his eyes. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down his cheek. "He likes you," she continued. "He is a good judge of character, better than his father." The words were still sharp, but they lacked their former venom. They were laced with a deep, abiding sadness. He looked up at her. In the faint light from the harbor, he could see the sheen of tears in her own eyes. "I loved you," she whispered, the confession wrenched from her. "I loved you, and you broke my heart. You broke my life." "I know," he said, his own voice breaking. "Let me spend the rest of my life trying to mend it, not as a duke, as a man, as the man who should have been your husband, in truth as well as name, as the man who should have been a father to our son. I ask for nothing. I will live here, in my small room, for the rest of my days, if it means I can see him, if it means I can see you." He stood up, facing her. He did not touch her. He did not dare. He simply stood before her, stripped of all his defenses, his soul laid bare. "I love you, Eleanor. I think I loved you from the first day I saw you, but I was too much of a fool to know what it meant. I know now. It means trust. It means faith. It means I would rather tear down my entire world than cause you a moment's pain. I failed that vow, but I will not fail again." Leo suddenly came running down the pier, his small legs pumping. "Mama, Mrs. Gable has baked a pie." He stopped when he saw Alistair, his happy expression turning shy. Eleanor looked from Alistair's ravaged face to her son's innocent one. She looked at the dossier in her hands, a history of lies, and she looked at the man before her, a man who had shed his title and his pride to live in a miserable room in a forgotten village, just to be near them. Penance had been paid. Atonement had been offered, not in words, but in deeds. She made a choice. It was not a surrender. It was a beginning. "Come inside, Alistair," she said softly, her voice holding the first note of warmth he had heard in 5 years. "The wind is cold." They returned to Blackwood Manor a month later. It was not the same house. Eleanor ordered the heavy, suffocating draperies taken down. Sunlight, bright and cleansing, streamed into the long, neglected rooms. She was not the same woman. She was no longer the decorative Duchess, a quiet accessory to her husband's life. She was his partner. She took charge of the ducal charities, redirecting their immense resources to found homes and schools for women and children cast out by society, women like her. Her work had purpose, passion. She moved through the world with a confidence and agency she had earned in the salt and wind of her exile. Alistair was not the same man. The remote, arrogant Duke was gone, replaced by a husband who listened, a father who adored his son. The emptiness inside him was filled, not with power or duty, but with the quiet joy of a family reclaimed. He was a better Duke for it, more just, more compassionate. He had learned humility in the hardest way possible. 1 year later, on a warm summer afternoon, they were in the gardens of Blackwood. The air was sweet with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. Alistair was on his hands and knees on the lawn, growling like a playful bear as a 5-year-old Leo shrieked with laughter and tried to climb onto his back. Eleanor watched them from a nearby bench. She held the small, carved wooden lark in her hand, its wood worn smooth by years of anxious touch. She no longer needed it as a reminder of a painful past. Now it was a symbol of a love that had been lost, and then, miraculously, found again, stronger and truer than before. Alistair caught her eye. He stopped his game and smiled at her, a genuine, open smile that reached his slate-gray eyes and transformed his entire face. It was the smile of the young man who had carved a bird for a girl he was trying to court. She smiled back. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of unspoken grievances. It was a space of deep, comforting peace. It was the sound of being home,